Well, we might as well get started. Hi, I'm David Weicker, and I am the coordinator for NOC mentoring. And this is the mentoring group of World Para Athletics. So many of you are already NTOs for World Para Athletics, but not necessarily all. So this might be a refresher for some, and it might be new for some. If you can put yourselves on mute, that would be great. Then if you have any questions, just throw them in the chat and we'll deal with them when. Take it away, Fanny. Fanny
Great.
is the coordinator of World Para Athletics for.
Not quite, but maybe one day.
Yeah.
Great, thanks, David. So as David said, my name is Fanny Smith and my pronouns are she and her. I'm actually the Para Athletics Development Manager with Athletics Canada. And some of you may have taken part in my webinars a couple months ago, maybe now, with BC Athletics officials. So there might be some repeat here, but I think rinse and repeat is always good. I'll run through my presentations, and if you have any questions, just either keep them for, there'll be a pause, or put them in the chat, and David or Serge can kind of flag me that there's a question. So I'm new to para athletics. I'm new to track and field and athletics altogether, but I have been supporting and working with athletes with a disability for about 10 years now in a variety of different roles. So volunteering, boards, I've been mission staff at major games, and now this kind of administrative role. Before I move any further, I do want to gratefully acknowledge that I'm on the territory of the First Nations and Tsawwassen. So I'm on the West Coast. It's a small community south of Vancouver, and I'm always grateful to be able to live in this beautiful community. That's a picture of the beach just down the street from my house. So most of what we're covering tonight, I've taken from the Becoming Para Ready, a document that lives on the Athletics Canada website, and that covers a lot of the basics of para athletics and a lot of the ways in which we are, raising awareness towards supporting athletes with a disability in our system. So you can refer back to that document after this presentation, or we can send a link further on. So as David said, a lot of you are already familiar with para athletics. You've probably already been officials at para athletics events. So some of it might not, tonight might not be new. It might be a review, but I hope that you'll get a little tidbit of new information. So I will kind of go over a bit of a general knowledge of para athletics in Canada. I'm not going to go into the details of the rules and the technical stuff as much, because I'm new to track and field and I'm not an official. So I actually don't know the rules in and out as well as most of you on this call. So I believe that there's a whole series of sessions that will really break into the specific rules of events. So you can put them in the chat if it's like really kind of pressing, or follow up with David and Serge afterwards, or keep those more technical type questions for those technical sessions. I guess just before we get started, I always like to say that this is a safe space to ask a lot of questions. If you have these burning questions around working with people with disabilities and you never wanted to ask them or didn't know how to ask them, we certainly can ask them here. I like to keep a portion of the session at the end where we stop the recording, so those questions can be asked if you want to, or you can send them directly to me in a direct message, and I will read them out anonymously. So this is just a quick agenda. There's 2 sections, so we'll start with really just talking about para athletics and the Paralympic Games a little bit, and then we'll move forward. So If there's any questions right off the bat, let me know. If not, I'll keep going. I see it's hard for me to see reels. Okay, it's David. It's hard for me to see the chat. So if there's something major, please flag me through voice, David. All right, so I think most of you probably know this. Athletics is the biggest event at the Paralympic Games, or at the Olympics, as it is in the Paralympic Games. In para-athletics, we've done really well in Canada, and we've reached the podium every year since 1968. Chantal Petitclerc, which is now a senator for the federal government, is actually our most decorated Paralympian. And another thing that's really interesting around para-athletics, if you've been around any other Paralympic sports, para-athletics is one of the only 2 sports that actually offers opportunities for athletes in all 10 eligible impairment types, as determined by the International Paralympic Committee. So I might use the term IPC moving forward instead of International Paralympic Committee. So there's 10 eligible impairment types, all of which are able to participate in para-athletics. And I'll cover those a little bit further. This picture here is a picture of Nate Reach. She's a BC athlete who won gold in the T37 1500 meter in Tokyo. We also had a gold in the F46 shot put. And then Brent Lakatos, who is one of our wheelchair racers and a very well decorated racer, took home 4 silvers in Tokyo. So we did well on the Olympic side, and on the Paralympic side as well. So I've already said this, it's the largest competition. We're looking at about 164 medal events for the Paris Games. And the events are the same on the Olympic and the Paralympic side. Again, you probably know this if you've worked on both sides, with the exception of the events that are listed here: hurdles, steeplechase, hammer throw, pole vault, triple jump, race walk, decathlon, and heptathlon. The cool thing about para-athletics is there's actually 2 unique events that we have in para-athletics versus on the athletics side. So we have the club throw, which is this picture at the bottom right of the screen of the girl in the green pants. She's in her day chair. So in this event, they are allowed to participate in their day chair if they want. And the club throw is for category of athlete that have a lower function in their trunk and their arms. And then the other unique event is universal relay. So that actually was introduced in Tokyo, and it has 4 legs, 2 males, 2 females, and they have a visually impaired athlete. They have an amputation or similar impaired athlete. They'll have a CP stroke or traumatic brain injury athlete, and then a wheelchair athlete closing off the race. And then looking ahead into the LA Games, we probably will see frame running being added to the program. This is a new category or sport class of events for athletes with a more severe impairment, usually caused from CP. And that is actually quite popular in Europe at the moment, Australia. So Denmark is actually one of the most ahead nations as far as developing that sport. So you may have seen it already. You may see it at a domestic level as we develop this sport here in Canada, but it won't be added to the Paralympic program until 2028 at the moment. And so having said that, the program will vary from one cycle to the next. So in Paris, we're looking at 3 less events than we had in Tokyo. And that's often just based on the field, the depth of the field. So maybe there's less countries that have athletes in these categories, or they may, remove one event to make room for another event. The rules are governed by the World Para-Athletics. You all know this because you're here because of that. And most of the rules are identical. And then they'll have some modifications and considerations that are actually based to make allowance on the impairment of the athlete. Now, you may hear me go back and forth and refer to the Paralympic program. And so obviously the pathway to the Paralympics and the events that may be chosen at some international events are based on a Paralympic program. However, if you are officiating at a more domestic event, there may be some open categories or some para categories that still allow athletes with a disability to participate in, but they may not necessarily be part of the Paralympic program. So just a little bit more on impairment types, if that is the first time you're hearing that. The International Paralympic Committee, so the IPC, once again, is the governing body for Paralympic sport and classification internationally. So they use the definition of impairment types as it's defined by the World Health Organization when they're addressing athletes with a disability to determine their eligibility to participate in sport. So it's based on how their function in sport is impaired by their disability or the medical condition. So it's in 3 major categories. We have vision impairment, intellectual impairment, and physical impairments. And so, you know, the terms disability and impairment in a day-to-day language, they can kind of seem interchangeable. And you might hear me refer to an athlete with an impairment or athlete with a disability. But really the disability comes into play because it implies a social component and it's a general umbrella term. So a person's disability may or may not be caused by an impairment, whereas the impairment actually refers to the medical condition that would affect someone's function and their ability to do certain activities and how they interact with the world around them. So someone might still have a disability, but they might not be classifiable for Paralympic sport under the system that the IPC has established. The most obvious example would be someone that's deaf. There's no category for them at the Paralympic Games, but there are some more less obvious examples that you know, they may not have an eligible medical impairment that classifies them. It's a very complex system, and I'm brushing over it on purpose because while it's part of my day-to-day, it really shouldn't affect officiating's rules, except to understand the different impairments and to understand that the rules are based on how their function is impacted by their impairment, and that's how the considerations are made. So again, it's based on their ability and their functional impairment. People are always curious about this. It does involve some paperwork to confirm their medical condition and a physical assessment that's done by a panel of certified experts. And it is required for them to compete at nationals and beyond. So to go to national championships, one does have to have a national classification or above, but in a recreational, domestic kind of club level meet, classification is not required. And obviously in some cases it's pretty straightforward, even though I cut off Greg's arm here. Those who are familiar with Greg Stewart probably know that he's missing his arm here where my mouse is showing. And so he has a lower limb or upper limb impairment, and it's a pretty straightforward situation. Whereas someone like Pam, although I'm not 100% sure of all of her ins and outs, she has a spinal cord injury, and those sometimes may or may not be straightforward based on how their spinal cord injury affects their function. Now, athletes may be classified and then given a review date, and they may be undergo a new classification review, and that's can be because their condition changed. It also applies for example, athletes of short stature. They will continue their evaluation for classification until the age of 18. Someone with a vision impairment that has a degenerative disease will also continue to be evaluated, and the time frame can vary from 1 to 2 to 4 years depending on the condition and what the classifiers determine. I'm just going to check the chat. Let's see any questions. So this is just a quick graphic to, you probably, again, I'm just going to stop saying that because I don't know, I don't want to make assumptions at what people know, but you know, I've referred to T37 or F46. So T means track, F means field, and long jump in this purpose because of the skills or the function that it needs. We put it into a T, into a track event in Paralympic sports. That second number refers to their impairment, and then that, the first number, their impairment, and then the second number is just giving a little bit more of a description of the impairment based on the classification rules. As a general rule of thumb, the smaller the number, the more a function is impacted. So a T11 would have less vision than a T13. So in the Becoming Para Ready, there's a lot more information about this if you're curious and you want to nerd out on classification a little bit. So this is kind of like the piece that's a little bit more related to officials, and this is what I've reviewed in previous webinars. Why would an event be WPA sanctioned? So WPA sanctioning is required for para-athletes who are internationally classified so that they can ensure that their performance results are recognized. So if they show up to an event and it's not WPA sanctioned, their results won't count towards their ranking in the world ranking list. So whereas able-bodied athletes might compete to improve their world ranking, para-athletes qualify for Athletics Canada, Canadian Athletics Performance Pathway, so our CAP program, and major championships like World Championships and Para-Pan Ams and Paralympic Games through their ranking. So having access to a WPA sanctioned event that is well stocked with officials that understand the rules that relate to the WPA rules really goes a long way for para-athletes. So depending on the level of event that you might be officiating, just like when you're officiating different age groups at a lower level, like provincial or regional event, athletes might be learning about the rules. So you can kind of be a little lenient in that manner and kind of like help them along the way. I recently played wheelchair basketball tournament for the first time, and I'm still learning the rules, and the ref was super great at saying like, no, that was a foul, and here's why. So I continue to be able to learn that. But moving from national championships above, athletes really should start to know the rules and understand what it means. How are athletes that compete track and field events classified T or F? That's a good question. So they would receive a classification for both. Sometimes it's the same. So they would be T46 and F46, and sometimes it's a little bit different. And I don't know all the ins and outs on why that's different, but it would have to do with their functional impairment. So how their impairment affects the function of throwing versus the function of running or another track event. But they would be evaluated separately in the field of play. So they get evaluated in a kind of like a medical room setting where they get the paperwork and they'll get like their functions assessed in more of a medical way, I guess, for lack of a better term. And then they get assessed in the field. So if they are getting classified for a track event, they would get assessed on the track doing their track event. And if they're also wanting to get classified for field, then they would assess them doing a throws or whatever their field event would be. I guess my going back to the officiating a WPA sanctioned meet, like we saw in the beginning, there's over 160 potential events that that are part of the Paralympic program. Now, having said that, that is considering one event for each sport class. So sometimes when we have smaller numbers, you might have sport classes that are combined. You might have para-athletes that are integrated within able-bodied heats. So especially when you're working with ambulatory athletes. So at the top right of this picture is Thomas Norondo. Thomas is missing part of his left hand. So he would be integrated into an ambulatory race. But it's important that you understand that Thomas can use a starting block helper like he is in this picture, so that when he shows that at that start line, you're aware of his considerations as a para athlete in his sport class. So one of the ways that officials can do that would be to review the start list, review the entries of the para athletes, and see where you actually have them. They may not show up in all the events. They may not show up in yours. They may show up on one day and not the next, but just kind of understand what sport class you have. So sport class is at T46, at T13, whatever. And to understand what considerations need to be taken for those athletes in those events. And I guess that last piece is, not to make assumptions. So not all disabilities will be visible. An athlete with a vision or intellectual impairment may not actually appear to have a disability. And so a T13 or an F13, which is a visual impairment, they don't compete with a guide or an assistant, and may not appear to have a vision impairment. And so they might blend in with that start line, but it's still important to make sure that you know where your para athletes are in your competition, so that you can make sure that the rules that apply to them are used. Yeah, so this is, I know this is covered greatly in the further sessions, because I listened to some of the sessions that are to come, and they're great in going into all these details. But some of the modifications and the considerations that will come into play for para athletes. So in addition to that starting block assistance that I pointed to in Thomas's example, we also have the eye covers and proper glasses, and so those are definitely covered in detail as we move forward in these sessions. So another few examples to kind of keep in mind is, say, an athlete with cerebral palsy, which is a disability, might have some balance issues, and they can't really be held too long in the starting blocks, because they'll end up with spasticity, which is the impairment, and that's so we're basing that rule on their functional impairment to try not to keep them too long in the starting blocks. If an athletic with the I believe that I'm going to leave that question to David, because I know that he's answered that. When you have a chance, David, there's a question in the chat that I think you'll do a better job answering than me. Another thing to keep into consideration is not all wheelchair racers would have a spinal cord injury. So some may have spina bifida or an amputation, which means that their function is very different than someone with a spinal cord injury, but they might all be in a race at the start line at the same time, because the numbers are small. And so for wheelchair racers, the commands are the same, but you should kind of pay attention to their hands and make sure that they've stopped moving and they're on the push rim before kind of moving forward, because the different hand function will definitely affect how they get into those positions. So it really is that fine balance between allowing for further considerations when a para athlete is starting off, and maybe bending those rules a little bit, and then understanding that at a certain level, these athletes need to know the rules, like all athletes that participate in track and field events. And there should be mutual respect on both sides, between them and you and them. And so that's, I guess, the main message here at the end of the day. You can ask the athletes, you can ask the coaches. They will be the best people to kind of advocate for themselves what their needs are, again, as long as it fits in those WPA rules. So I have a quick little video that summarizes all of this that I'm actually going to skip over and keep for the end, just to ensure that we have time to review everything. So I'm just going to pause quickly and see if there's any other questions. So the question that's in the chat right now says, if an athlete with an upper limb impairment is running a race using a starting block, is the responsibility of the athlete or the meet? And I can't actually 100% remember that. David, I think it's the athlete has to show up with their block, but are you still there, David? If you're able to confirm that, or if someone else knows for sure.
I believe it's the athlete brings their starting aid.
Yeah. Okay. Thank
The
you.
meet
That's what I
doesn't
thought
provide
too. That's what I thought. So I'm just going to pause and see if you have any questions. Whoops, I'm going to skip this and come back to it. Sorry, my kids are making a snack behind me. All right, if there's no more questions, I'll just, okay, great. So the next part of the kind of session is really kind of moving away from the sport specifically and just talking a little bit more about disability awareness, language, behaviors, interactions, and kind of getting more into that human aspect of things. So here's kind of like an overview of those 4 areas that we're going to talk about. Sometimes this is uncomfortable for people. It might be the first time that you're hearing some of these terms. And by no means, it's never to try to make anyone feel uncomfortable. So if you do have any questions and you want to ask them privately, you're always welcome to do that. Just give me a moment. All right. So I think that to kind of start to understand why these rule modifications are important and why I spend all my time advocating for better sport for people with disabilities is that we actually have 1 in 5 Canadians over the age of 15 that have a disability. And so we crunch these numbers, and there's only about 1% of people with a disability that are part of an NSO, like Athletics Canada. So the numbers of the percentage of people that participate in sport with a disability have always been very low. And so obviously we want to try and break down as many barriers as possible to see, to get more people involved. This other piece there, disability in the context of Paralympics, these were done in 2 separate sessions. And so I kind of just revisited the concept of impairments and how the IPC really refers to impairment types to determine who's eligible to participate in Paralympic sport. So having said all of this, you can imagine that in an effort to be inclusive, it also does exclude people at times. The classification process is not perfect. So what we really strive for at the domestic level and in the provinces and the regions is to really make sure that everyone has a place to participate and compete, whether or not they are on this Paralympic pathway, just as not every kid is going to show up and become a Paralympian. Put this big definition up here because I do believe that it is part of understanding how to move forward in a more inclusive and integrated athletics community. So to understand disability, understand para-athletics and para-sport, I think it's important that we kind of understand what ableism means. And so some of the big words here that I've kind of highlighted is that it is a discrimination based on a belief that typical abilities are superior. So it's rooted in assumption that disabled people require fixing, and defines people by their disability. We often have less than and other harmful stereotypes and misconceptions around disabilities. Through the Becoming Para Ready document, again, I really invite you to kind of have a perusal through it. You know, I did a lot of research in putting that together, and research in disability sport context also shows that there's several social, cultural, organizational, economic, community, interpersonal factors that all of us as a community need to consider when we're supporting para-athletics. And so you'll see how all of these kind of like work together to support the athlete in the middle. So we really do all have a role to play, and sometimes that can feel overwhelming, but I think that it's accessible to everyone, and that it's just often a matter of breaking down the barriers and hearing the information multiple times for some of you, and just kind of like making that first step forward and saying, yeah, you know what, I'm going to learn more about this. I also want to kind of stress that the term people or persons with a disability is really used to refer to a group or a population. So it's not a monolith. There's it's a diverse group with different needs and different wants, and two people could have the same disability or the same type and experience completely different barriers and have completely different needs. As I mentioned just previously, some disabilities are invisible and are hard to see. So communication is really key to fully understand an individual's need. And that's obvious, like we all want to have our needs met. But sometimes we might be a little worried to ask the questions, but it's important that we have open communication and ask the right questions in the right way. So parasport and para-athletes, I've said that, I've used the term athletes with a disability. How does athlete with a disability differ from para-athletes? So I've done this as a poll before and I forgot to set it up, but the definition of the Paralympics actually means parallel to the Olympics. So often people think it's the Paralympics, or even that Paralympics stands for the Paraplegic Olympics. If you work in the WPA, you probably already knew that it was parallel. And para-athlete or Paralympian or athlete with a disability. So para-athlete, athlete with a disability, they're pretty much the same. Para-athlete really refers to an athlete participating in para-sport. And an athlete with a disability might be a para-athlete, but they may not be a Paralympian. So just like on the Olympic side, you're only a Paralympian if you've gone and competed at a Paralympic Games. And the other kind of like factor to consider around the Paralympics is that performance matters. Just like at the Olympic Games, there are qualifying criteria for athletes to go to the Paralympic Games. As I said before, they often will qualify through a WPA sanctioned meet. So it's really parallel to the Olympics as far as performance, as far as how, high performance and elite these athletes are. There's often confusion around the Special Olympics and the Olympics, the Special Olympics and the Paralympics. And simply explained is the Special Olympics actually refers to an organization and a whole system, and it's not a single event. And whereas the Paralympics, we may sometimes talk about the Paralympic movement, but the Paralympics, like the Olympics, are a single event and it happens every 4 years. The Special Olympics is actually solely for athletes with an intellectual disability, more often than not, athletes with Down syndrome. And while the Paralympics and the para-athletics has a category for intellectual impairments, they do tend to have a little bit of a different differentiation. Let me see questions. Great. So I choose this this next slide in this presentation to kind of illustrate the athleticism that is required at the Paralympic Games, and just how exciting it is and how parallel it is to the Olympic side. So this is maybe some of you were in Tokyo, but this is the T64 race on the men's side in Tokyo. So T track 64, lower limb deficiencies. Felix Strang of Germany won gold in this event, 100 meters in 10.76 seconds. And that silver medalist coming in second was at 10:78. So really, really photo finish. And, Andre is under 10 seconds. So, really fast times still. The record for the 100 meters in the T12, for example, so T track 12 VI, those athletes, the T12s, may or may not compete with guides, by the way, which is covered later in your track session. That world record is 10:43. So really exciting stuff happening on the para-athletic side as well. So I am a big fan of words, and that words matter. And I, try to really be intentional and conscious about the words I use, especially when it comes to inclusion and disability spheres and other areas of diversity, excuse me. So this is just a little cartoon to illustrate that, she says, what do you prefer to be called? Handicapped, disabled, or physically challenged? And Mr. in the wheelchair says Joe would be fine. And so this is just a tongue-in-cheek way to say that using derogatory terms or outdated terms or ableist language, just continues to enforce disrespectful stereotypes. Having said that, individual preferences on how one might identify is also important to keep into consideration. So I always use a person first language. So athlete with a disability, person with a disability, in that kind of way. But some people with disability may refer to themselves as disabled athlete, disabled person. It is something like with everything is evolving, and it's an individual preference. And I think the onus falls on the community itself to identify as they wish. So I recommend starting with that person first language. And as you become more comfortable or know someone better or know the community better, then you can have a conversation with that person around their individual preference, or kind of like, stay in tune with the changes. So that disabled piece is starting to be a little bit more common, but I still use that person first language. It's definitely always evolving. And also, one of the things that I've noticed being around a lot of para athletes is that those athletes may refer to themselves or their peers in a certain way. And so just, some caution around not mirroring words and behaviors and expressions that maybe you're not familiar with, or that the person you're interacting with, you're also not familiar with, and to not kind of use some terms that might be offensive hearing from you versus a peer with a disability. I also don't like made up words, and are not recommended to use things like diversibility, handicapable, special needs, challenge, handicapped. Disability is not a bad word. There's no reason to not use it and when you need to. The other thing is, I think I've been pretty, I don't think I slipped up. I slip up, everybody slips up, but you're comparing the Paralympics to the Olympics, not normal sports versus disabled sports. You can say able-bodied sports in the sport system. That's still commonly used, as we refer to one system versus the other, or one pathway versus the other. And I guess the important thing is, don't be embarrassed if you do have a slip up. It happens to me, 10, 15 years later. So if you use a common expression like "see you later" or "gotta be running" or "let's go for a run," and someone is a wheelchair user, oftentimes those common expressions are just part of the vocabulary and it's fine. But don't be embarrassed if you feel like you did a offensive slip up, apologize, move on, and they'll likely poke fun at you or say something, but as long as your intention comes from a good place and you apologize, if it's really bad, then there's no reason to be too worried or embarrassed. Interactions. So I like to give this example around how to refer to a disability and when it's, and only to do so when it's relevant. So if I wanted to bring attention to Amanda Rumry here, I might say, "Hey, Julie, like, look at that girl over there. She has, can you see her? She has 2 braids. She's wearing like a AC singlet. And she has like Canada flag on her chest. She's had a really good race." Versus saying, "Hey, look at Amanda over there. She's the girl with the 1 arm." There's no reason for me to point that out as the first thing. So unless it's needed to refer to their disability because it's part of a rule, or you need to make sure that their accessibility is taken into consideration, you only need to refer to the disability if it's really needed and it makes a difference to your conversation. Some of these examples might seem really obvious, but I bring them up because they happen. So you want to make sure that you're speaking directly to a person with a disability. So some athletes might have sport assistant or a guide or a parent with them. Always speak directly to the person. You don't want to give assistance without asking them first if they want it. I think it's human nature to want to come to someone's aid, and maybe someone's struggling with the door, or they drop something on the ground and they're struggling to pick it up. If you can say, like, "Would you want some help?" If they say no, you move on. They're probably fine and used to that. Obviously, if they're in danger, like something's going to fall on them, or they're going to fall over and it's obvious, then of course be a human being and help them out. But don't insist and say, "Are you sure? Are you sure you need help?" That happens quite often. They can, people with limited hand use can, even if they wear an official limb, can shake hands. So it's totally appropriate to reach with your hand out. I don't know what I'm trying to say. Lean in with your left hand. If they're missing their right hand, you can do an elbow bump or a fist bump if they have a limited hand function. And when meeting a person with a visual impairment, it's always great to identify yourself. Say, "Hey, Billy, it's Fanny. How's it going? We met at such and such event." While that might not happen necessarily in your officiating duties, you might come across mobility equipment on the other hand. So just kind of keeping in mind that a person's mobility equipment, whether it's their wheelchair or their artificial limb or their cane or their crutches, it's part of the personal space. And so you don't want to touch it without their permission or move it unless, again, it's sitting in the middle of the track. Some athletes might have difficulty speaking, or their speech might be a little harder to hear or slower. So be patient and wait for them to finish rather than correcting them or filling in those gaps for them. And I think that that's mostly, just kind of scrolling through my notes here. I think that that is mostly the main pieces there. So this again, I'm showing because it has come up as a question. If there's a track accident, what do you do? And I don't know, I'm sure there's some rules. So I don't know the ins and outs of what may happen, but I know that you do not want to be running into the middle of the track and helping these people. There's set people that will help in the case of a crash or an injury such as this. But it did come up as a question, what do we do? Do we run in? Do we help them up? You would basically do like you would in any other kind of instance where there might be someone that trips over another person. So follow those security rules that are put into place. It's not your role to run onto and quote unquote save the people. Use the athlete and coach experience. I think I kind of like briefly touched on this earlier, especially at a lower level event, or if you're not sure, of course, there's that that relationship where as an official, you're supposed to know and implement the rules and enforce them. But sometimes these athletes and coaches have been around the circuit for a long time, and maybe you're new. So you can kind of like use their experience to better understand what the rule modification might be, or to better understand their needs. And yeah, just remembering that those rule modifications exist to support the athletes to compete on a level field, taking into consideration their functional impairment. So that athlete will know best what their impairment is. And so again, that fine balance between using them for communication and reference and better understanding their needs and enforcing the WPA rules. I've already talked about that mutual respect. You want to treat everyone the same way as you would, just treat everyone the same way with the same respect and the same equitable access to competition. And that's it. That is all I have. It is rapid fire. It's short and sweet on purpose, because it's really just meant to be a quick introduction and a quick overview. As you go through the next sessions, I know that it goes further into detail. A lot of this stuff gets repeated again, so it starts to stick. But please, my email is available for anyone that has any questions. The Becoming Para Ready document just really kind of like covers a lot of this stuff in further detail as well. But happy to answer any questions if there is any.
And if there are no questions, I would like to thank Fanny very much for her presentation. It's the second time she's given this presentation, or maybe the third time for the second part of this presentation, but it doesn't get old. And one of her last slides is remember the rules, but the rules also, like World Athletics, change every 2 years. And there should be a new rule book for World Para Athletics coming out soon.
I think it's out now. I think it was published like at the end of last month.
Oh, okay. It was supposed to be. I don't think it has been though.
Oh, no, I thought I looked
No.
recently. I could be wrong. You'll know better than
No.
me.
I haven't received a new rule book or notification of new rules. And I know there is a new rule that's being debated. It's for people with severe communication disorders who are also tend to be in the CP category. And when they're throwing in a seated throwing position, they need to be able to communicate with officials and with their own coach and administrators or whatever. And so World Para Athletics is looking at allowing this to occur using speechwriter apps that a lot of athletes use in their daily living. So
That's
it's
right. That's a perfect example of a modification based on one's functional impairment.
right. And in Rio, there was a meeting that was held about the use of tethers. And so that ended up leading to the change of the tether rule. Prior to Rio, they could let go of the tether 10 meters in advance of the finish line. And so we had to put a cone on the infield, so it would indicate where the 10 meters was. And now the rule says you have to be using a tether until both the athlete and the guide runner are through the finish line. So those are examples of rules that are modified for para athletics.
I don't know if there are questions and you just don't want to do them on the recording. If so, we can definitely stop it, but I feel like everyone's been pretty open so far.
Yeah, if you have any questions and don't want to put them in the chat group, you can always send them to me or to Jane or to Serge or to Fanny directly after the presentation. And any one of us will endeavor to reply or respond to your question. And that even includes you, Ian Reed.
Fanny, are you going to show us your little video before?
Oh yes, thanks for the reminder. It's such a good one. Hold on, let me find it. Should I share this down? That's all. I still do that 2 years later. Let me know if it worked or doesn't work, I guess. Yeah.
Athletics has been part of the Paralympic Games since 1960 and offers a wide range of competitions and events. It's open to male and female athletes in all impairment groups. Classifications start with T for track or F for field. Track events include all distances from 100 meters through to marathon, as well as high jump, long jump, and triple jump. Field events include discus, shot put, javelin, and the club throw, which is unique to para-athletics. This is followed by a double-digit number. The first number indicates the type of impairment, and the second number indicates the degree. The lower the second number, the greater the impact of the impairment on the athlete's ability to do track or field events. TNF 11 to 13 are for athletes with a visual impairment. Rope tethers or other devices may be used by runners to link with their sighted guides. Only in the last 10 meters can they be apart, and the athlete must finish ahead of the guide runner or face disqualification. An assistant may be used to act as a caller to provide acoustic orientation to indicate takeoff in jumping events or throwing target areas. T20 athletes have an intellectual impairment. In the T30s, athletes have a coordination impairment, such as cerebral palsy. T32 to 34 compete in wheelchair racing, and F31 to 34 in seated throws, whilst T and F35 to 38 compete standing. T40 to 41 athletes have short stature. 42 to 44 athletes have an impairment in one or both legs, often requiring a prosthetic, but it also includes athletes with impaired muscle power, impaired range of movement, or leg length difference. In classes T45 to 47, athletes have an impairment in one or both arms. T51 to 54 athletes compete in wheelchair racing due to a leg impairment or loss of muscle power in the legs and/or trunk. For field events, these athletes are split over classes F51 to 57, competing in seated throws. They also have a limb impairment, for example, from a spinal cord injury. Whether you want to see athletes run 100 meters in just over 10 seconds, marvel at a high jumper with one leg clearing 2 meters, or a thrower propelling a discus nearly 50 meters, this is the sport for you.
So it doesn't have the frame running in there yet. So there'll be 71 to 73, I think, and track only. And then for short stature, there is no track at the Paralympics. So they're just F40 or F41. But I like this little video. It kind of recaps it in a quick way with a better accent than mine. Yeah, if you don't have any questions, then I'll let you on to your evening. And yeah, I'm Fanny.smith@athletics.ca. So I'm always happy to answer any questions.